This paper is titled, "You Can't Go Home No More, Africans in America in the Age of Globalization." It's a draft of what became chapter 2 in the book that I co-edited with Professor Olufemi Vaughan, titled West African Migrations, Transnational and Global Pathways in a New Century. The book was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2012. It's one of a 2-book set. The other book is Transnational Africa and Globalization. So here it is. You Can't Go Home No More, Africans in America in the Age of Globalization. The introduction is home, identity, and identity politics. And I begin with a couple of Yoruba proverbs. Ajo le dun, konile ma rele. No matter how enjoyable a journey might be, one is bound to return home, is one. Also, Ile labo ìsinmi oko, home is the resting place for those returning from the farm or from labor. This means you labor abroad and you rest at home. There are many clichés about home. Home is where the heart is, for instance. However, since this is a contribution to a project on transnational Africa and globalization, foregrounding how personal experiences, professional interests, and scholarship shaped experiences of diaspora and transnationality, I feel the necessity to return to Nigeria from my present location in North America, and will weave in scholarly ruminations on home, sojourn, and return, all within the context of how transnationality and globalism have shaped my experiences. Since I do not see myself as a passive victim of circumstances, I will also give some insight into how I have consciously and otherwise shaped my experiences of these worldwide phenomena within the limits of my capabilities. I will do this through the use of my understanding of the Yoruba language and my experiences and knowledge of the culture to explicate what these experiences and phenomena mean to me. While because of its use in daily life as a means of communication, language is often taken for granted as a product of primordial relations. One can well say that the linguistic is political. To reiterate, the use, study, and proliferation of language are political. But one of the byproducts of successful colonization is the unquestioning embrace of the language of the colonizer, particularly by those well-educated and trained for leadership in the post-colonial systems of power. Ngugi puts it best when he said, "The very words we use are a product of collective history," unquote. Thus, rather than language being just a mere medium of communication, it is laden by the weight of the past. It also carries the burden of the present, and the long shadow of the future is cast upon it. But for most users of any language, it seems to serve as a means through which they communicate with the people they encounter in the course of their daily lives. However, even in these mundane day-to-day encounters, attentiveness to the ways in which ordinary people describe and explain, maybe even make fun of the things they and others do, can illuminate systematic as well as fluid understandings of the role of language in their lives. I want to use a Yoruba òwe or proverb to illustrate my point. As aforementioned, in this chapter, I draw predominantly on the axioms of the Yoruba, who are my people. I'm confident, however, that it is not only the Yoruba that believe that òwe lẹṣin ọ̀rọ̀, bí ọ̀rọ̀ bá sọnù, òwe la fi ń wá. That is, proverbs are the horses of words or language. When words are lost, it is with proverbs that we find them. This means that proverbs illuminate words and reveal the deep underlying meanings in words. To illuminate some of the points I will make in this chapter, besides the proverbs above that specifically refer to home, I will use a few other Yoruba proverbs listed below. First, àtẹ́lẹwọ́ ẹni la fi ń tún ìwà ara ẹni ṣe. It is with one's hands that one rehabilitates one's character, or with hard work, one can transform adversity into good fortune, or self-help is crucial to success. Second, àgbájọ ọwọ́ la fi ń sọ̀yà. Unity is crucial for success or self-realization. Third, ọmọdé gbọ́n, àgbà gbọ́n la fi kọ́ Ilé Ifẹ̀. Ilé Ifẹ̀, the ancestral birthplace of the Yoruba people, was built based upon the wisdom of both youth and elders, or elders learn from the youth, just as youth learn from elders. Not even the elders are all wise or, have the totality of wisdom. Then there is the proverb. Ojú ọ̀run tẹ́yẹ fò láì fapá gúnra wọn. The sky is big enough for all birds to fly without hitting each other on the wing or colliding with one another. Although I use Yoruba proverbs in this essay, as I said before, similar sayings exist in all African societies and communities, and more Africans, I think, should see them as sources of our people's philosophical epistemology and a contribution to the world's pool of knowledge. How do we reconcile this saying with the glaring fact that contemporary Yorubas and Africans so blithely privilege colonial languages over the rich and amazing heritage of their own people? Some would consider it a cop-out, but I argue that one of the reasons is pragmatism. Another is the success of colonialism as a system of domination. And yet another, sheer carelessness and lack of attentiveness to the politics of language. It is instructive to me that Ngugi also says the following, and I quote, The present predicaments of Africa are often not a matter of personal choice. They arise from an historical situation. Their solutions are not so much a matter of personal decision as that of a fundamental social transformation of the structures of our societies, starting with a real break with imperialism and its ruling allies. Imperialism and its comprador alliances in Africa can never develop the continent. This was in his book, Decolonizing the Mind, the 2004 edition. Ngugi's analysis, first encountered when I was a university student in Nigeria toward the tail end of the 1970s, and later explored in North America when I was a graduate student, seeking alternative, rational explanations of Africa's predicament, helped me to understand some of the reasons why Nigerians, when I was growing up, were often proud of their colonial heritage. Some Nigerians still are, and it is a conundrum to me. If they could speak English, that is, these Nigerians, they used it and preferred its use over and above what they considered more pedestrian languages local to Nigeria, which everybody and their mother-in-law knows. As a matter of fact, if you were able to deploy what was referred to as, quote, Queen's English, unquote, or the language with, quote, Oxbridge accent, you were regarded as the creme de la creme of Nigerian society. Although I do not have personal experience in a Francophone and Lusophone African context, or even in other Anglophone African countries, my experience as a sojourner in North America over almost 4 decades has shown me that many recent Africans in America, like me, are prouder of their adroitness and facility in the language of their former colonizers than of their ability to speak, write, and read their own languages, or face the more difficult issue of understanding their culture in a contextualized manner. Educated Nigerians and other Africans, to my mind, still remain more passionate about than Europeans and Americans about the correctness of English grammar and diction in everyday communication. And Europeans and Americans don't actually care as much as we do. News commentaries, popular literature, scholarly analyses in the communication arts, jokes, and satire attest to this. While not entirely aware of the meanings and implications of transnationality as a young person, at the time, when I was young, that is, I came to recognize that travel is educational. This realization was fostered by the pervasive understanding that forays outside the local community was welcomed, encouraged, and oftentimes the efforts of one individual to go, quote unquote, abroad, which may be as close as travel to the big metropolis or some place where the trading was more profitable, or education or the training and discipline garnered from an apprenticeship could be acquired. These efforts would be sponsored by the entire community. When such moves occurred, they could be to other communities that, like I said, were close by or far away. They could also be to other regions within the same country or to other West African and African countries. Those who were most affluent, however, sought to ensure that their progeny had the very best of everything, and they mobilized their financial power to ensure that this said progeny go abroad to do what they used to say was gathering the golden fleece, a euphemism garnered from Greek mythology, probably used more to demonstrate the user's erudition and learnedness and sophisticated grasp of the ethos of Western education than anything else. So people who were going to gather the golden fleece were going for higher education in the metropole. Some of these sojourners never returned, and nobody understood what could possibly hold them so much in thrall that they refused to return home. If this were an account that only referred to the most affluent, it would be a very dull story. There have always been traders, laborers, religious clerics, and other sojourners who left their local communities and ventured abroad. The Igbo, Yoruba, and the Hausa, being the majority ethnic groups in Nigeria, were more noticeable than other groups, and thus enable one to see such diasporas in great relief. But all Nigerian peoples travel for long and short periods, and no rendering of diasporic Nigerian history would be complete without including their experiences. When Nigerians were summarily banished from Ghana in the 1970s, and some of my relatives whom I had never seen and who had lived in Ghana for several generations, some never even visiting Nigeria in my short lifetime, returned to Nigeria under such dire straits that all family members, including mine, had to shelter some of them. I realized that my own family had some permanent sojourners who called other places home. Some of their children did not even speak or understand Yoruba. And those who did speak it spoke with accents that sounded very strange at the time. Some of the relatives were, of course, known to one and all. Even the youngest children knew them and their orikis because they constantly moved back and forth between Nigeria and Ghana. They also moved between Yoruba and the various Ghanaian languages. They had homes, relationships, and sometimes businesses in both countries. They were able to establish their lives according to some semblance of normalcy much faster than the relatives who had embraced Ghana as permanent home. The event of their being exiled from Ghana was, at the very least, puzzling to the young person that I was. And at other levels, it was a window into immigration and transnationality. Nigeria, of course, engaged in a retaliatory mass deportation of Ghanaians, and the horrid nature of the movement is today immortalized in the phrase, quote, Ghana must go, unquote. This is the name for one of the cheapest traveling bags that I know of, although recently there were also designer versions of it that are selling for only God knows how many thousands of dollars. Another conundrum, but to continue, Ghana Must Go is one of the cheapest traveling bags that I know of. It is so readily available that you could get it at the very last minute to carry any luggage or spill over from too much luggage when you're traveling. The Ghana Must Go bag, fashioned from synthetic plastic jute, sewn on machines in China, widely marketed in poor countries, whether in Africa or Eastern Europe, even here in the good old US of A. Where they're less present, though, they seem to be so inexpensive and flimsy that they appear to be disposable. It is interesting that I'm now a long-term transnational person today, and that the innovations in communication technologies, as well as affordability of travel, make it easier for me to maintain connectedness with home and family, despite the distance between the US and Nigeria and the relative closeness of Ghana to Nigeria. I have even had occasion to use Ghana Must Go bags once in a while, although I never received one stuffed with cash, as they are reported to be when carrying bribes to induce the powers that be to look favorably upon a supplicant's cause in critiques of the Nigerian political and economic systems. Looking beyond Nigeria to the rest of West Africa, one cannot help but note that human migrations in this region are largely a result of, quote, population pressure, poor economic performances, and endemic conflicts. This is a quote from Moju's 2005 publication. The population flows have been consistent and are ongoing because, quote, historically, migrants regarded the sub-region as an economic unit within which trade in goods and services flowed and people moved freely. This is also a quote from Moju. The Dioula, Hausa, Yoruba, Igbo, and other ethnic groups have been involved in long-term migratory movements all around West and Central Africa and are diasporic. They contribute to the contemporary movements within and outside the continent, drawing upon old knowledge, as well as learning and using new mechanisms, information, and networks to make strategic decisions on when, where, and how to move. When the move is made, there are often practical considerations that must be engaged. And such opportunities and challenges as encountered in the place of sojourn are more easily addressed by those with the wherewithal to do so. I came to North America for an education, fresh from the required year of Nigeria's National Youth Service Corps, or NYSC, in Ewegai, a Bini village where I was the first female teacher ever. Ewegai was very rural at the time And for me, who grew up in Lagos, very different, very difficult to adjust to, and very isolated. There was neither good road, nor electricity, nor pipe-borne water. I taught English and history. This was followed immediately by a stint teaching history at Orile Baptist Secondary School in Agege, Lagos State. My wedding, and after a couple of months in Elisha, where my spouse was a physical therapist, and we left for New York, were also early points in this history. My husband left Nigeria for a master's in physical therapy. I left Nigeria for a master's in political science. We both attended Long Island University, Brooklyn Center. But en route, we stopped in Holland and Ireland for a honeymoon. Many people enthuse about New York and their excitement on getting to the Big Apple. I must confess that my arrival was less than joyful. We arrived in the dead of winter. The Brooklyn Center of Long Island University is in downtown Brooklyn, opposite Junior's, which I later learned was a Brooklyn institution famous for its cheesecake. At the time of my arrival, downtown Brooklyn was kind of bummed out. I remember thinking, this is it? Maybe my expectations were too high. Maybe it was the honeymoon and going from pretty, picturesque, quaint, well-organized places to the rugged, grimy, and seemingly down at the hill, Brooklyn, where that day the snow was melting and it had that grimy look with bits and pieces of paper and other flotsam and jetsam stuck in it. I must confess that I had come reluctantly, mostly because I was a newlywed and my husband could only get his post-bachelor's physical therapy education outside Nigeria. Since I could have studied for my master's in political science at the University of Ibadan, which is my alma mater, and I could have done so more inexpensively, more comfortably, more in sync with my environment, and more valued as a member of society. I was ambivalent about America. I missed having a big, verdant university campus and had to get used to the urban campus feel of LIU, or Long Island University. Being at LIU was good for my scholarship. The faculty was excellent, kind, approachable in a way that was very unfamiliar and seemingly informal compared with my previous experience in Nigeria, where the relationship between student and faculty was very formal, and a student was expected to be deferential and humble. I was also surprised about how easy it was to excel. I embraced my studies in a single-minded manner since I had a plan. 5 years thence, I was returning to Nigeria with a PhD. But of course, my now going to be 43 years of being in the US show that I was really dreaming. And Nigeria, anyway, at the time did not cooperate. The economy was deteriorating apace. The military had its jackboots on the country's neck. In the 1.5 academic years that it took me to secure my master's, the country, that is Nigeria, seemed to be determined to go to hell in a figurative handbasket. The exchange rate was a good indicator. And while the Niger exchanged at a rate of $1 to 2 naira in 1981, by 1986, when Nigeria was eventually forced to accept the IMF and World Bank's structural adjustment program, the Naira had been devalued by 50%. I won't even try to see how depreciated today's Naira is. Suffices to say that you need over 1,000 Naira to get $1 today. But at the time, there was immediate advantage to all who earned their income or profits in dollars, and it disadvantaged the majority of Nigerians whose earnings were in Naira. The exchange rate fluctuates, and in September 24, 2010, when I wrote this paper, the rate in the alternative market for the Naira is 155 of the Naira to the dollar. When I was in Nigeria at the end of August 2010, the rate was 151 or 152 Naira to the dollar. Like I said before, today, the rate is over 1,000 Naira to the dollar. I have always thought that neither micro nor macroeconomic analysis, nor much of social science or even humanities analysis has fully considered the implications of such chronic and unrelenting downward departure in the value of money on ordinary people's lives, and the ways in which such circumstances affect everyday decisions. Note that I am aware of studies that talk about precarity and the ways in which neoliberal economic policies intensify them and cause tremendous dislocation and trauma to people's lives. I think there needs to be even more done. And I'm actually considering doing an update of my first book that looks at the instantiation of structural adjustment in Nigeria. Anyway, to return to the paper. In the early to mid 1980s, the news from home was not heartening by any stretch of the imagination. But I still was determined to finish up my education and leave for Nigeria. My siblings and parents also wondered how I was coping, and they encouraged speedy completion and return home to begin a professional career. My little sister, Kemi, who had sickle cell anemia, had a crisis and passed away while I was finishing up my master's in 1982. I wasn't told until I submitted my thesis. My family members, who did not know how I could handle such bad news so far away from home, kept the news away from me. This also meant I wasn't able to go to her funeral. So it has always seemed as though she didn't really die, as though one day I would turn the corner or walk into a room or wake up and find her there. At the time, I was inconsolable. I went home, but this was after the fact, after she had been buried. I had a sense of gloom that pervaded my consciousness. I thought, maybe if I had been there, maybe I could have done something. But really, what could I or anyone do when someone's time had come? So I became resigned. With a master's in hand, an admission to the PhD program at Columbia University, my excitement on the educational front was boundless. I approached the prospect of my study at Columbia as one of the best things that could ever have happened to me. My optimism continued for the first year. My husband was also a PhD student at New York University. I liked Columbia better because of the campus feel and because of its reputation. My husband had to study and work. Being a physical therapist, he was in one of the highly sought out careers in the US, where there was not enough personnel to meet the country's needs. He began with a year of practical training and quickly got a job that promised him a green card. I had no such luck. Political science was not one of the highly desired fields. It still isn't. We also did not know that we could have included me in his application, and no one told us. So while my husband was able to get his green card, I maintained student status with all the disadvantages entailed for accessing support and funding for higher education. So, for everybody's information, I paid for my Columbia education. And it was as a result of my husband having a job that we were able to pay this. Also, I did some freelance work, and it was a very hard time. We hunted for our first apartment and encountered blatant, unmediated racism, particularly from landlords that advertised vacant apartments and were warm on the phone, but cold in person, informing us that the place was already taken in the short time it took to ride the bus or subway to the location. This was very shocking, but life goes on, and it did. Since we finally found an apartment in Clinton Hill, now fashionable, but then kind of run down in parts. As I saw it then, the Clinton Hill apartments were okay, but they seemed to me at the time a big complex of huge apartment buildings where I always felt like a chicken in a coop, coming out to free range at dawn and back home to roost at dusk. The struggle of making ends meet on one paycheck, burning the candle from both ends to meet the educational goals we had established for ourselves, trying to establish a new family were all formidable challenges. But we pressed on. The Yorubas, after all, say, "Iṣẹ́ kì í pani, iṣẹ́ ní í pani." Hard work does not kill. It is poverty that kills. And iṣẹ́ ni oògùn ìṣẹ́. Hard work is the antidote to poverty. We threw ourselves into our work. Longing for home was a constant phenomenon for me. There was really no one to confide in. In the pre-World Wide Web days, with epileptic telephone connections in Nigeria, with an inefficient mailing system, it was challenging, to say the least, to maintain a sense of connectedness. And some of my siblings didn't like to write. And also, letters tried to put an optimistic spin on things. It was a frustrating time. Things are so different now. Well, in 2010, my teenage son just informed me casually over his hurried New York school day breakfast that his older cousin in Nigeria celebrated her birthday 2 days ago. Being somewhat familiar with his favored mode of communication, I asked, Facebook? And he confirmed my suspicion by giving me a very teenaged, of course. So unlike me, my children at the time could so easily communicate with their cousins wherever they are in the world, and it's a widely dispersed transnational family in all the continents. My first year at Columbia ended with excellent grades and a pregnancy. This threw up both joy and apprehension. How was I going to be able to afford both a child and an education? Columbia is not affordable, at least not for me, and I did not have any financial aid. This was an option open only to citizens and naturalized students. I knew there was no question that I was having my child, but I also knew that I could not afford Columbia at the same time. I finally resolved that the only thing to do was to take a leave of absence, have the baby, and then return. Unfortunately, my advisor and other faculty took this decision as a sign of laziness, disinterest in my education, and lack of focus. Mind you, none of them suggested any way to help me to financially access the means to pay for this education. I guess for people who never had to worry about the existential angst imbricated in most of the matters that I faced at the time, there was no way for them to understand, empathize, or to be sympathetic. I felt even more isolated. From the time I had my son until I graduated from Columbia, my education became one of my important priorities rather than my only priority. Juggling all the responsibilities that arose out of these priorities was, to say the least, difficult. Isolation bred alienation. And I remember thinking as I hurried and walked around Columbia campus, quote, I do not belong here, unquote. I also wondered why I felt like a stranger on campus, yet I pressed on and did not consider what could have generated such a feeling of alienation until it was time to do the Point 4 review that preceded the comprehensive examination. I couldn't quite understand the pervasive gratitude that I felt. The review is typically an assessment of one's progress and prospects as the comprehensive exam approached. I imagine its purpose is to undertake a rigorous review of one's performance and offer advice on what was needed to prepare for the examination, success in which was a requirement for writing one's dissertation. What I expected to be a pro forma review that should have helped me identify my strengths and weaknesses was instead at the time the most negative experience of all my life experiences to date. My advisor told me that if I took the comprehensive exam, I would fail. Having no previous experience of failing any examination, and knowing that while difficult, the examination would not test me in anything that I had not been exposed to as a student, or at least anything that could not be studied, marshaled, analyzed, and recalled in a high-pressure situation, I was at least puzzled and curious as to how my advisor came to his negative conclusion. I was also quite frankly shocked that my advisor was not supportive and fair. My grades and performance thus far did not warrant this assessment. So I asked him what the basis was for his conclusion. He told me this was a tough examination, and majority of students that took it failed it the first time. He did not want me to experience this disappointment. I then responded that he should do a review based on my record thus far in the program, because I was confident that my record did not warrant this conclusion. He proceeded to ignore me until it was clear that I was not leaving until the records were consulted. This he reluctantly did, and then apologized for being unfair. I expressed my disappointment, and since I know that nothing is more convincing than success, promised to be back for a full-fledged discussion with him after I passed the examination. Let's take a pause here.